So you've been on Instagram, you've seen your favorite influencer has just said that carbs make you fat. You may have even heard terms like no rice to look nice, eat bread, you'll end up dead, or even the classic and my personal favorite, no carbs before marbs. Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to be answering the age-old question, do carbs make you fat? Let's get into it, shall we? So welcome back to the MacroCrunch YouTube channel, everybody. I hope you're having a great day. Today we're looking at, are carbs bad for you? Now, there's a lot of studies done around this, and there's a lot of sort of misconception also built around this as well. There's two sides to this story, as in most cases. However, I personally always like to look at the scientific evidence and base it on my own body's response. Therefore, what I'm saying is going to be based primarily off of science, but there's also going to be things that I include in this video that work for me, but may not for you. But just to preface, before we get into the discussion, I do need to say I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical professional, I'm just someone who's, lost weight in the past, gained a bit of muscle, and I'm now sharing you my tips, my tricks, my knowledge from that experience. So the format of this video, we're going to start off with highlighting what carbs actually are. Then we're going to break down what they do for us and how we can use them in our body. And then we're going to break down why people think they're bad and why that misconception is so commonly, known now. But like I said, let's get started and let's get into what actually are carbohydrates. But at their most basic level, carbohydrates are made of building blocks of sugars. Now, there are multiple different types of carbohydrates dependent on how many sugars they have in them. And there are 6 major types. Monosaccharides, things like fructose, glucose, these are all single sugar unit carbohydrates. Disaccharides, now these are carbs with 2 sugar units. This is things like sucrose and lactose that you find in milks. Then you've got the third type, oligosaccharides. These are carbs with 3 to 9 sugar units in them. The most well known of these are oligofructans, and these are found in low sweetness vegetables like onions and artichokes, things like that. And then finally, you've got polysaccharides. Now these are anything with 10 or more sugar units in them. Now these break down into 2 further categories, which I mentioned earlier. We've got starch and non-starch polysaccharides. Now starches, you may be familiar in things like rice, pastas, or even at the root vegetable level, you've got things like carrots, potatoes, sweet potatoes, onions, things like that are all considered starchy polysaccharides. And then non-starch polysaccharides are more us as dietary fiber. Now these are things like whole grains, fruits, vegetables. And you'll often hear people on the ketogenic diet, which if you watch the channel, I don't endorse. But people on there will actually cancel out dietary fiber from the net carb total of a foodstuff, which is a way of them getting around eating some carbs essentially. Now I'll touch on this again later in the misconception stage of the video. However, one thing to note is that all of these different groups are all categorized as carbohydrates. But carbohydrates are also known under the following names, which usually refer to specific groups of carbs, which can also make it confusing for people. These include sugars, simple and complex carbs, resistant starches, dietary fibers like we mentioned earlier, probiotics, and finally intrinsic and added sugars. Regardless of what carbs it is you're taking in, whether it's a monosaccharide or a polysaccharide, it doesn't really matter too much if you're looking at it calories in, calories out for weight loss or weight gain. However, certain people, myself included, like to eat for function and enjoyment, but when you're looking at function, it can actually benefit you to tailor certain foods, especially carbs, for an energy source, to tailor it to a specific group. Now I'm going to get more into this now when we talk about the types of carbs and what they actually do for us. So at the bottom line, carbohydrates are an essential macronutrient part of our diet. They provide energy for basic tasks like moving, thinking, growing, anything you do, you're needing energy for, and carbs are a fantastic source for that energy. It also covers the background functions that you don't necessarily think about or you'll never feel or notice going on in your body. For example, digestion. During digestion, all sugars and carbohydrates get broken down by the enzymes into their monosaccharide state. They then get absorbed by the body and create a glycemic response. The body then uses said glucose in muscle, brain, and other cell responses. Also, interestingly, carbohydrates play a huge role in the building and structure of things like our muscles, our cells, and our organs. But how does our body use carbohydrates as energy? Let's break it down then, shall we? Now, our body prefers carbohydrates that are broken down into mainly glucose. This is because things like our brain, muscles, organs, tissue, and other cells all prefer to use monosaccharides as their energy source. But even further in detail than this, each different gram of carbs, and I use quotations there as a blanket statement for carbs, but each different gram of carbs actually provides different amounts of energy. So for example, starches and sugars are the main carbohydrate energy source, and they provide 4 calories per 1 gram of them. Polyols give 2.4 calories, and a popular polyol or sweetener or sugar replacement people use is erythritol. Now this isn't actually digested at all, therefore it gives 0 calories. And finally, dietary fiber gives only 2 calories. But then it all comes down to how you actually use that energy. For example, if it's not used directly, the body will store glucose by converting it to glycogen, which is a polysaccharide like starch, and gets stored in things like the liver or your muscles as a readily available source of energy at a later time when you don't necessarily have an influx, i.e. a meal or food. And this commonly occurs when you're sleeping at night and you're in a long fasting period, or when you're working out and you've depleted the energy that you already had stored or that you had from a previous influx, like a pre-workout meal or your breakfast, for example. You're then going to use that stored energy. Now, you may have figured out by now, if you don't use that energy, that stored energy converts to fat. And this is what leads people to believe that carbs make you fat a lot of the time. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the big ones, especially when people do read into the science and they overlook the fact that you do have to use the energy. It sounds crazy, but it is one of the biggest things that people do forget or they underestimate. I'll cover this more very shortly. Just to wrap up how our body uses carbs though, I want to touch on the glycemic index. Now this is a really interesting sort of, not necessarily idea because it is stated in fact. However, it's something that I do like to bear in mind quite a lot, especially when I'm working out for a specific purpose, i.e. training for an event or trying to get in the best shape possible or feel the best way possible. So the glycemic response is essentially this. When our body consumes food, it triggers blood sugar to rise and then fall again. This is called the glycemic response, and it directly reflects the rate of glucose absorption within our body and during digestion. But a lot of different factors influence the rate and duration of the glycemic response, and there's 2 major categories. One being the food itself. We'll break down that one first. So firstly, the type of sugar or carbohydrate in the food. For example, fructose triggers a smaller glycemic response than glucose, for example. Then there's the structure of the molecule. For example, a starch with more bonds is easier to break down. Then there's things like the cooking and processes used, and then the other macronutrients in the food like your fats and your proteins, because we all know that proteins are harder to break down than fats and carbs, for example. But the second category of things that may influence the duration and rate of the glycemic response is the metabolic rate and the metabolism of the individual themselves. And these are factors that we don't really consider, and they're very much in the background of our mind, if anywhere at all, whilst we consume foods. Now, these are things that are so simple, like the rate of chewing, how much you break down the food before you swallow it and it enters your system completely. The rate of your gastric emptying, how often do you go for a poo? The transit time through the small intestine, now this is heavily influenced by the food stuff itself. Things like the person's metabolism itself, we all know that some people have a higher metabolism naturally, and some people have a lower one. And then finally, the time of day that the food is ingested. Now, this is a sort of another reason why the misconception is there. For example, you may have heard you can't eat carbs after 8 p.m. It's all nonsense. However, it does play somewhat of a role. For example, if you're going to bed at 10 p.m. and you eat something at 9:30, your body, when you go to sleep, slows down its functions. Therefore, digestion is going to be slower. Therefore, a glycemic response is going to last longer. But how do we know what foods will trigger what responses? Well, there's this thing called the glycemic index, and it matches up foods to a value based on what sort of response they will trigger. Let's break it down. Foods are ranked from 1 to 100. That's the value they're assigned based on their glycemic response they trigger. For example, a food with a glycemic index of 70 triggers 70% of the blood sugar response. And there are 4 major categories here. Foods with a low glycemic index, this is 40 and below. These are things like fruits, lentils, soybeans, cow's milk, carrots. Then you have foods with a low glycemic index, this is 41 up to 55. And a lot of foods, things like chocolate, noodles, pasta, bananas, dates, apple juice, all grain bread, strawberry jam. Foods with an intermediate glycemic index, this is all the way from 56 to 70. And these are things like brown rice, boiled oats, drinks, pineapple, honey. And then you have foods with a high glycemic index. This is anything over 70. And this is things like cornflakes, boiled potatoes, white and brown bread, French fries, mashed potatoes. This isn't a way of ranking foods you should and shouldn't eat. And again, that's another misconception. With all these misconceptions stacking up now, I think it's time that we cover why people think carbs are actually bad. And I'm going to share my opinion on that. Now, there are a few major reasons why I think people believe carbs are bad. First of them being, and the biggest one personally, is one that I haven't actually mentioned yet. And it's this. Every 1 gram of carbs that you eat stores 4 grams of water. Therefore, if you're eating a lot of carbs and you're weighing yourself the next day, it's possible that you will have gained weight even though you've eaten in a deficit. That being said, people can see this and be disheartened or think that they've gained weight because of the carbs they've eaten, and it's just simply not the case. It's all a facade. You don't gain fat by eating carbs in a deficit or at maintenance. The only way you gain fat, as we all know, is to eat in a surplus over a period of time. So therefore, if you're eating at 2,500 calories, the recommended daily amount for a man, and 1,000 of those calories are carbs, that's then 250 grams worth of carbs that day. Now this is quite low, but it's just so I can work out the maths easily. Now 250 grams of carbs times the 4 for the stored water that will come with that, that is then a kilo of water. Now water means nothing essentially. However, if you step on the scale the next day, it's possible you will have gained a kilo, which can be disheartening to people trying to lose weight. Equally, it can throw off people that are trying to gain weight and can give them inaccurate readings. Moving on, we touched on earlier that people often overlook the idea that you have to burn off the energy. You have to expend the energy that you're eating in through way of carbs in order to not have it stored as excess fat. Now, when I said earlier that people often overlook this, it's not necessarily a complete overlook. It's often an underestimation of what they need to do in order to burn off all they're eating. For example, a lot of people will go to the gym, lift weights for an hour and assume that they've burned thousands of calories. And this simply isn't true. I hate to break it to you, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it's honesty. It's just the fact that it is hard to burn off a lot of calories, but it is possible. It's just there's a hard way to balance it. For example, if you eat 2,500 calories and then you go on a bike ride for, I don't know, 10 hours, right? You then burn off your 2,500 calories. Done it, but you're going to feel so depleted because you've not replenished that energy. Therefore, you're not probably going to feel great after, despite feeling that you have burnt off all the energy. Do you understand what I mean? Last on this point is that when you see people training for things like marathons or endurance events, they'll often carb up the night before. This includes things like big bowls of pasta, oats, rice, all these sorts of high carb food sources that, you know, people will tend to eat just before events. Now, the reason that they do this is that they use foods that are going to take longer to digest. The ones with less bonds and less branches that we covered take longer to digest. Therefore, whilst they're eating and whilst they're sleeping, you know, the night before their event, they're storing this energy that they can then use over a long period of time because they know they're going to burn it off. That's to say, you can't then just carb up for a 30-minute spin session down your local gym. It just doesn't work. Finally, without going too much into a rant, I think the biggest reason people think carbs are bad is the complete misconception spread online now. The toxic idea that carbs are bad all stems from people who don't necessarily like to eat them, or, you know, they claim that they've lost all this weight or that they've got super lean by cutting out carbs when it just isn't necessarily true. But it's often the big names that will speak out and get the most response from it, and that is why it is so easy for things like this to be spread. However, that being said, I recommend that you, like I have, try and educate yourself on these sorts of topics because you will learn a lot. And I do believe that once you know things, you see more results from them in yourself. Therefore, ever since I educated myself on nutrition and whatnot, my results have multiplied. And it's because I'm better able to utilize the knowledge that I have. So I'll leave a link to the document and the journal report that I used for this video in the description below. I recommend you give it a read. It's really interesting as well, more than just what I've said. But that's it for this video, guys. I know it's a little bit of a longer one, but I wanted to kind of come back with a bang and make a good sort of informative video and let you know that it's okay to eat carbs. I've heard around, you know, my fitness community that I'm sort of involved with, and people that I know, that carbs are bad and they, you know, they don't want to eat them. They're trying to cut them out, and it's all nonsense. It frustrates me. So yeah, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know if you like this type of video in the comments below, the more sort of scientific ones. I love reading about this stuff, and I have a ton of saved journals on my computer, so I'm more than happy to make them on a plethora of topics. Don't forget to follow us over on the MacroCrunch Instagram account. It's at MacroCrunch down the bottom here, as always, and I will catch you in the next video. Go eat your carbs. Bye.